Welcome. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here for this, the fifth and the final Fast Forward lecture for semester 1, 2025. It's a great pleasure to have you all here to hear from Gill, who it says up there from Melbourne, but actually, as of recent weeks, Kapiti Coast. So, go the Hurricanes, I want to say. Just a little bit of housekeeping from me. Bathrooms up and out the door and around to the right, if you need bathrooms. In the unlikely event of some kind of emergency, we'll head out onto the footpath directly out in front of the building. I want to say a particular thanks to Julia Gatley, who's been really instrumental in helping put this series together and whose fantastic idea it was to bring Gill into the series and kind of as part of her kind of, I guess, trying to re-socialise her back into the New Zealand architecture scene, but also thanks to Jib. So Jib have been supporting this series now for a whole bunch of years through all sorts of ups and downs, through recessions, pandemics, and hopefully through trade war, whatever it is that we're leaping into. So I'm going to show you a video. Some of you may have already seen this video, but let's jump in. The fantastic folk at Architecture and Women New Zealand have been helping us to promote Gill's lecture, so I'm going to introduce Sharina Summerin, co-chair at A&W, who is going to introduce Gill. Thanks.
Awesome, thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Fast Forward lecture. It's a brilliant series that invites critical thinkers and bold practitioners to share their insights, challenge our assumptions, and help shape the future of architecture. So as Andrews mentioned, my name is Sharina Noel Summerin, and I'm an alumni of Auckland University, graduating with a Masters of Architecture in 2010 under Dr. Deirdre Brown, who was my main thesis supervisor. I currently tutor across the road, actually, at AUT, the School of Future Environments, and I'm also the current co-chair of Architecture and Women NZ, an organisation that supports and promotes gender equity in architecture across Aotearoa New Zealand through advocacy, networking, research and visibility initiatives. So tonight we are so honoured to host Dr. Gill Matthewson, an architect, educator and researcher whose work sits at the intersection of architecture, gender and equity. Dr. Matthewson was based in Melbourne, but she's just recently returned back, I think it was a month ago, back to Aotearoa, New Zealand. And she's a key figure behind Parlour, a groundbreaking platform that champions gender equity in architecture through research, advocacy and discourse. She's also a founding member of the XYX Lab Gender Plus Place at Monash University in Melbourne. So with a background in architectural practice and academia, Dr. Matthewson's work is internationally recognised for its rigour, depth and clarity. Her PhD, which explores the statistical and social positioning of women in architecture, has become foundational reading in equity discussions across the discipline. Her thesis contributes to knowledge by examining the complexity of gender in the Australian architectural profession through two main strategies, combining quantitative and qualitative methods in a complementary manner. Through her work, through her writing and work in public speaking and tireless commitment to research, she continues to ask critical questions about who architecture is for, who participates in shaping it, and how we can create more inclusive and representative professional cultures. Dr. Matthewson's contribution to Parlour and to the architectural community more broadly goes well beyond advocacy. She combines robust data analysis with a deeply humanist lens, reminding us that architecture is not only about buildings, but also about the systems, people, and structures that shape them. It's also worth acknowledging Dr. Matthewson's close connection with Architecture and Women NZ, an organisation that shares many of the values she champions through her work. As a supporting member and long-time advocate, her influence has significantly shaped A+W's direction, helping foster a more inclusive architectural culture here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Her presence this evening is both timely and deeply meaningful to our community. And A+W and I are currently undertaking quite a lot of research on gender pay gap reporting and on career breaks. So please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Gill Matthewson.
Thanks, Sharina. That was, I hate those sort of things. I don't recognise myself sometimes. But also thanks to Andrew and Julia who got me here, which is great. So, the path to Parlour. Sharina's just told you a bit about Parlour, but if you don't know, it's a research-based advocacy organisation working to improve gender equity in architecture and the built environment professions in Australia. I know that some of you might hear the word gender and think, oh, that's only about women, but systems of gender affect us all the time, every day. Each time we use a public toilet, shop for clothes or fill out a form, we are insistently reminded that we must be either male or female, men or women, boys or girls. Judith Butler argues that socially and culturally we don't actually make sense unless we are labelled one or the other. So unless you know, oh yeah, boy, girl, now I know how to behave with that person. Even things that ostensibly have nothing to do with sex or gender, like what we eat or the books we read, are often sold to us as if they are necessarily feminine or masculine. Now, of course, there are differences between men and women, but what those differences mean is constructed by all of us socially. We also tend to think that male and female, men and women are binary categories, one or the other. There are only two options, but even biology is not clear-cut, despite what Donald Trump has declared in one of his heinous executive orders recently. This is a great data visualization from Amanda Montañez and the San Francisco-based data visualization studio Pitch, and it's showing just how much of a range there is between the ideal biological female on the left and the ideal biological male on the right. And at different stages in life, conception, birth and puberty, there's a really complex dance between anatomy, genetics and hormones. And the male-female binary can get really messed with, very easily producing a whole range of situations in the middle here. And this is just a small cross-section of possible conditions stemming from one particular biological quirk. And that's the biology, issues of gender equity, let alone the multiple genders that people can identify with, transgender, non-binary. Gender is complicated. So my path to Parlour and issues of gender equity essentially come from a bit of a frustration with architecture. one that I think I share with a number of women, particularly some of those in the room. I can recognise a whole lot of friends here. And two questions that kind of summarise that frustration. One was, where are the women architects? And the second is, do women design differently? I would have to say that over the years, these questions have bred further questions. It's a very slippery beast. However, these weren't questions for me when I first entered the School of Architecture here in Auckland, back in the day, 1976. Oh, it's a long time ago. The intake was 74 people and 24 or 32% of us were women. There were many big social and economic changes happening in the 70s, and lots of things were changing. Even so, this was a much larger number and proportion compared to previous years. The intake of women had only reached double digits for the first time a couple of years earlier in 1972. And it seems that proportion of 32% was not actually reached again for at least another 10 years, not until the late 80s. In previous years, the handful of women accepted into the school were often told that they couldn't be a woman and an architect, and that half of them would drop out. And they would just not have what it takes to survive the school. So let's have a look at graduates. This is the proportion of female architectural graduates from the school. It's pretty low. We begin in 1958. But you can see it's bottoming out for at least a decade during the 1960s. Now, at that time, to get into architecture, you had to do an intermediate year, a year of 3 subjects from across the university. And from 1960 to 1971, the intermediate included a compulsory first-year physics paper. And you might think, oh yeah, physics, that's reasonable, you know, architects might need to know a bit about that. What's the problem? But a highish proportion of all girls' secondary schools did not offer physics at all, and smaller regional schools likewise did not offer it. Nor was it a particularly popular choice for girls in co-ed schools. I was talking to someone yesterday who said she was the only woman in her physics class in her final year of high school. And passing a first-year university physics paper without a grounding in secondary school physics was really, really hard. So there were social expectations that girls would choose arts-based subjects. So if you hear people talking about structural discrimination, this is it. This is an example. Oh, I forgot I had that little bit there, little yellow dots there, that show that very low thing here. Okay, once they lifted that requirement, you can see the numbers of women jumping and increasing and increasing. So being one of 24 women in our first year class meant that we didn't feel that unusual in the school. Others, however, thought we were. So here's some of us ended up in a newspaper. Lindsay, who's in the room, is in the shot there. Here we are learning the practical side of our architectural studies. Allegedly, we would never make carpenters, but we were enthusiastic. But it didn't take that much to get in the newspaper. In the same week, one of our classmates, Robert, appeared in the Sunday News in its radical news section showing near naked men. I told you there was a lot of change happening in the 1970s. This actually isn't the photo I remember. He did do another shoot where he posed with a T-square at a rather suggestive angle. And I have actually searched the microfiche files in the Sunday News at the Auckland Public Library, and I might be the only person who's ever done that, but I just couldn't find it. It's not a complete set. While I was at the school, where are the women architects was not really a question for me. There were no women architects mentioned, but that didn't particularly bug me. But every now and then there was a question around, are these women students designing differently from men? Some would mutter that our work was softer and featured curves a lot more. You know, there must be a direct connection between the shape and softness of our bodies and the architecture we designed. Of course, as if men's bodies are comprised of straight lines and right angles. But anyway, and if you're rolling your eyes right now, so you should be. It's a very simplistic and lazy connection and complete bollocks, except I actually did do curves. But for me, they weren't about softness. I was actually really interested in an architecture that did not impose conformity on people. An architecture that might enable other ways of living, working and being. One that was not dictatorial and especially not confining. My curves were an attempt to bring into form some kind of openness. I didn't succeed at all, but I still look for that quality in architecture. In the profession itself, we women were thought to have a natural adeptness in the design of kitchens and colours and cupboards for domestic and residential work. More recently, women are thought to have an affinity with the social infrastructure work of schools and hospitals, where our natural caring nature is considered to align with such projects. And all of this is just incredibly frustrating for women who would prefer to be free from such limiting assumptions about their skills and ambitions in architecture. But when we started moving into the profession in the late 1970s and into the 80s, where are all the women architects became a really pressing question. First off, we wanted to know that it was even possible. So we started looking for predecessors and role models. And we also wanted to know kind of why the profession seemed to be a little bit resistant to our presence. As Julia Gatley has noticed, it wasn't until the year 2000 that architectural histories in New Zealand could be relied on to mention women architects at all. I'll repeat that, 2000, long after we were doing it. But sometime in the early 1980s, I had a client who lent me this book by Esther James, who claimed she was New Zealand's first woman architect. He never paid his fee, so I kept the book. This is her outside one of her houses in Oraki Road in the 1960s, we think, which is still standing, but with some alterations and shutters. And Sarah Treadwell asked me to give a presentation about Esther, and this became my very first foray into researching a woman architect. And for this fabulous book, Making Space, Elizabeth Cox, the editor and main writer, asked me to resurrect my research and write about Esther. And I especially wanted to track down this building, which Esther in her book called A Gift from the Sea. And it's a fabulous story, very evocative, but as I found out, not exactly true. Anyway, the building does exist, it just wasn't built the way she said it was. And I haven't been able to find it in the 1980s. Anyway, I found this incredibly scrappy note that I made back in the 1980s, detailing where the house was, as told to me by Esther's daughter. And I have to say, I'm super impressed that I kept my notes and utterly appalled at how bad they are. Like, they're all like this and they're all over the place. Anyway, new technology is available now, so I went on Google Street View from Melbourne and I found it. The little, it was the chimney and the little sticky outfit that made me recognise it. And then I was able to track back and find earlier real estate photos of it. When you look at these photos, though, there isn't much sign that it was designed by a woman. And in the 1980s, I and others did wonder if there was a feminine sensibility or aesthetic in women architects' design work, more nuanced than the curves business. We were raised one way and socialised into a sensitivity to the needs of others, whether we wanted to or not. But we were trained in another, and so we kind of straddled these two worlds. And more than that, perhaps we had the best of both of those worlds, and that might make us better designers. And such claims were quite exciting and empowering as we tried to find our identities in architecture. This was an important publication from the US exploring these matters. In particular, the article by Marguerite Kennedy about male and female principles in architecture was influential. I'm not particularly convinced by these now, and in fact, many feminists would argue that feminism is precisely about not attributing skills and abilities and sensibilities based on gender alone. Although Kennedy is quite clear that both men and women can have feminine and masculine traits. And of course, there's a lot of difference between different women. Generalising is quite difficult. And Kennedy herself became a very interesting economist because she decided what was wrong with architecture wasn't necessarily the lack of female principles, it was the way money worked. And so she developed a completely different system for how money might work. You can look her up if you're interested. This work by Phyllis Berkeley about women's fantasy spaces was also kind of appealing at the time. This Adobe extension to a rectangular house sets up a kind of dialogue between hard and soft and straight and curved and static and flowing space. Berkeley argues that these opposites are kind of transformed into options, which is, I think, quite an interesting idea. But you have to be very careful with very hard and fast binaries of these sorts. They can get a bit problematic. But the Heresies Journal did also introduce us to Eileen Gray, who was never mentioned while I was at the school and should have been. The canon is a lot richer with her inclusion. The design of the E1027 here is extraordinary. In a piece published in the Heresies Journal called From Eclecticism to Doubt, Gray argues for a more nuanced modernism. She was writing in the 30s. And she was against buildings being considered through a visual lens only, and that kind of visual detachment. Good architecture for Gray is much more than Le Corbusier's, quote, masterly, correct and magnificent play of masses brought together in the light, much more. Although, it is kind of hard not to be seduced by all the archy images that we're surrounded by and bombarded by. But to good architecture, it's more than the visuals. There are wonderful subtleties in this building. The plan is really quite complicated and is kind of teases you as you move through it. It's also complex historically, with Corbusier making his mark on it in ways that Gray did not appreciate. He was quite envious of this building. But it's also from here that Corb swam out and was never seen again. Really complicated history. Another woman architect overshadowed by one of the great names of modernism is Lily Reich with Mies van der Rohe. I became absolutely fascinated with this building when I lived in Barcelona for a short time in the 1990s. And it's got incredibly slick lines, it's great modernism. But, I was a woman alone in a foreign country and, slick lines, pick-up lines, nah, don't need it. So I started reading about the building. And became intrigued with the presence of three women involved in the conception, realisation and interpretation of the pavilion. They represented for me the kind of professional, symbolic and intellectual presence of women in architecture. And I ended up doing a master's by research about it. I called it Sex Lies in the Barcelona Pavilion. I now see this research as a kind of a search for my identity in architecture. So the three women, Lily Reich, Mies's collaborator from the mid-1920s until 1937, when he buggered off to the US and kind of left her behind. And she showed the kind of unwritten history of women's contribution to architecture, and particularly the erasure of collaborators. I traced her presence through weird omissions and oddities, and how the work attributed to Nice alone at this time has been written about in traditional histories. Reich was essentially raised to maintain a particular view of architectural history, the great singular genius architect, and male, of course. Collaboration is what Beatrice Colomina calls the dirty little secret of architecture. We all know it's the way that good architecture is produced, but the profession and academia too often still cling to, or at least default to, celebrating the individual genius designer, even if they don't exist. The work of the architecture profession is incredibly diverse, but culturally the profession just valorises one aspect of what architects do, and that's the design stuff. Secondly, there's a statue of a woman in the courtyard, and I found weird things out when I started looking into her. And her presence enabled me to look at the symbolic form of a symbolic female body in architecture. And I traced it through the ages and posited that it might even underwrite all architecture. This was really speculative and may have erred a little bit towards a bit of wishful thinking, but I found this kind of different perspective on the history of architecture quite affirming. And thirdly, there was me reflected in there. The Barcelona Pavilion has been called the Palace of Reflections. And for me, it offered an opportunity to reflect on what I knew and what I had experienced and kind of make sense of it all. And once I finished the Masters, I was more comfortable in architecture until 10 years after completing my Masters, I was really, really pissed off to find out that the next generation of women were again asking, they were looking around and going, where are all the women in architecture? It seemed that although women were in architecture, it was in far smaller numbers than one might have expected from all the numbers of us who had graduated in the 70s and 80s. The pipeline into the profession was flowing, but the profession itself was leaking, and leaking really badly. So how many were there? This was my first foray into digging into numbers. Women were 13.4% of registered architects in New Zealand in 2004, and that's an almost tenfold increase on the 1975 numbers. So that was good. That's a good increase, and it's now around 731%, also good. But along with where are all the women came another question. Why are women leaving architecture? Why was the profession so leaky? And why were women leaving architecture in greater numbers than the men were? Others at the time were also noticing this, and this is a diagram from an RIBA survey from 2003. And this summarises why the women that they surveyed left. And there are a few answers in here that might look horribly familiar 20 years later. Along with ideas about the ideal architect being a solo male genius, there's something going on related to concepts of masculine and femininity and the ambiguous role of the architect within the building industry that seem to make staying in the profession difficult for women. So my questions and their answers were getting more and more complicated. And so we come to Parlour, which grew out of an Australian Research Council linkage project entitled, as they often are with a very boring title, Equity and Diversity in the Australian Architecture Profession, Women, Work and Leadership. It kicked off in 2011. And with this funding, which was a big chunk of money, came some real firepower to work out just what might be going on for women in architecture, and importantly, what might be done about it. And, the research group included a who's who of Australian women architectural academics: Naomi Stead, Karen Burns, Sandra Kaji O'Grady, and with me doing my PhD later in life as part of it. And importantly, the group included Justine Clark, another alumna of Auckland School here, who had just finished being the editor of Architecture Australia. Now, when I first started working on my PhD, there was a definite vibe from friends and colleagues of, isn't that gender stuff just a bit last century? But by the end of the project, we were surfing a wave that we had kind of helped to create as well. Across the English-speaking world, there were now multiple groups, including Architecture Plus Women NZ here. Website resources, commentaries, surveys, petitions, all with a similar focus, highlighting and trying to understand the gender inequities of architecture. One of the things that made a difference in Australia, a big difference, was this diagram. Part of my task on the project was to count the number of women in the Australian architecture, and I was helped by a research assistant, Kirsty Volz. And we had the numbers eventually, because it's not easy to find those numbers and do all the calculations. But numbers and percentages bore people, especially architects. Our eyes kind of tend to glaze over a bit. And I was randomly looking at something online, and the idea for the circle diagram came. The larger the circle, the bigger the proportion of women in that category. Junior roles to the left and senior roles to the right. So you can really see those circles just getting smaller and smaller as we go from left to right. And this was a diagram that launched 1,000, we really do have a problem, and it's not a last century thing after all. It was real, and this diagram helped change the conversation in Australia. I posted it on my Instagram, not that I had many followers, but a number of people sort of went, oh, that diagram, that just changed everything, which it did. So it was a really important bit of work. In 2012, we launched the Parlour website. The research project had proposed a bit of a website, but none of us academics thought that it would become what it has become. Justine was, as she says, an editor in search of a project, and that project became Parlour. And the great thing about having a very recent editor of Architecture Australia involved was when she rang up people to hustle up some writing for the launch of the website, they took her calls because they didn't realise she wasn't the editor anymore. So the site was launched with some very good pieces. This one by Andrew Maynard became quite popular. It was about how he has worked really hard to never be in a position where he needed to work long hours. And it was tricky to arrange this, and it was well outside the norms of contemporary architectural working culture. But he explained how he did it and why. He essentially thinks that you are a better architecture if you have a life outside of architecture. And I'll talk more about that a bit later. The article got picked up by Art Daily and went a little bit viral, and across Australia, young architects were upping tools and walking out of the office at 5:30, which really messed with the business model of a number of practices, which often rely on younger architects working long hours. Parlour has lived on long after the funding from the project had finished. And the site offers a range of formats for sharing research, stats, action, open letters, surveys and conversations. We have editorial, we organise events online and in person. We went online over COVID. Melbourne was locked down for something like 200 days. We really needed that online kind of stuff. And we provide guides. There's a couple that you can see at the bottom in the middle. One is Guides to Wellbeing in Architectural Practice, launched last year. That came out of another ARC funded project led by Naomi Stead. And the Parlour Guides to Equitable Practice. Wow, they went viral. People were downloading them all over the world. We thought we'd written them for Australian conditions, but they really hit the mark for a lot of people around the world. And we're in the process of revising those at the moment because we didn't put in things like sexual harassment. We'll get there. That will be a new one. We have continued to conduct research and including analysing the census every 5 years. This is the updated circle diagram, still showing the same pattern of the circles getting smaller as we move from junior roles to senior. And there's a little bit of extra information down the bottom here that we were able to extract from the 2021 census. It's the number of employees an owner of a practice has, and women are just 12% of the owners employing 20 or more people. We're also looking at the data longitudinally, and you can see the bubbles get bigger over time, you know, as they rise up through the time, which we might expect. So graduates in Australia, 2021, 49%. I know that the graduate level from Auckland here is well over 50%, and I think it's in the 60s last time I looked. But, you know, this is an average of all the schools in Australia. This is the registration data, and one of the things we're really pleased to have seen here is that big jump in women admitted to the registers between 2011 and 2016, and getting much closer to graduation rates in 2021. One of the findings of my PhD was that credentials, like registration, matter more for women in terms of their career progression than they do for men. It cuts across all professions. So we've been encouraging women to register since we launched Parlour. This is a census data, and it's quite nice that the bubbles for owners of incorporated businesses is now big enough that we can put the percentage inside the bubble instead of outside it. And this is the Institute of Architects membership data. If the circle diagram triggered that "oh, we're in trouble" response, this diagram came out in our report on the 2016 census data and triggered an "are you kidding me?" response. It's showing the pay gap by age group, and that's the safest way to kind of show a pay gap. And why in the 25 to 29 age group there is a 5.2 gap is a bit of a shocker, because you were talking about people who are at relatively the same levels of experience and, you know, recent graduates, etc. Now, by 2021, possibly as a result of that previous slide, that it's dropped down to 2.6, which is better. But you can see that the 25 to 29 age group in 2016, they're now 30 to 34 in 2021, and they've still got a 5% gap. So once that gap starts, it just keeps on growing, and you can see it gets way out of control. 13% in later ages. For 2021, we also started to look at pay gaps by cultural diversity. When we started Parlour, Paul Walker, who's Justine's husband, and he's another alumni of Auckland here, he sort of said, "Are you just making the world better for middle-class white women? Or the architecture world better for middle-class white women?" And that was a bit of a like, ooh, that's a bit embarrassing. Yes, we better look at other stuff. And it came through quite kind of quickly that we started looking at a wider range of information. Because gender is, of course, not the only factor that can help or hinder people as they make their way in the architecture profession. Cultural background intersects with gender and class, especially class, to influence professional experiences and opportunities. So this shows pay gap by gender, by ancestry. And the pattern is quite clear and quite confronting. But I would have to say that this census data is a bit blunt and a bit crude. Like, how do you identify your ancestry? Like, if you're an American, do you say that you're originally from, if you're a white American, do you say you're originally from Sweden? Or what do you do? How do you identify it? It's a bit kind of blurry, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done in this area. But we do know that the architectural workforce is increasingly culturally diverse, but it is not equitable. While this chart shows that there's been some, real growth over the last few years, this does not mean that the Australian profession is moving rapidly towards gender equality. Because as much as I'm a numbers nerd, or on a good day I call myself a data diva, numbers aren't everything. Numerical equality is not the same as gender equality. In particular, stats don't reveal much of the nuances of the cultural and structural dimensions and forces that lead to all the kind of deflating circles that we saw in the circle diagram. It matters how, as well as how many women are participating. And that was the other part of my thesis. And for that, I interviewed 70 odd architects, women and men, to kind of work out what was going on in their careers. Now, some people, when they're talking about careers, they talk about it in just one dimension, such as what you can do to progress your career, like be more assertive, network more, lean in, etc. And there's a little bit of value in that, especially if your family or your education or your experience has kind of pushed you to be more communal rather than exercise agency, which is a kind of classic binary that's closely aligned with the gender binary. But they can also be a bit, let's fix the women because we're a bit faulty, which is nonsense. The pursuit of a career in architecture involves navigating a really quite complicated structural and cultural dimensions of a workplace and of the profession. In architecture, there are shared beliefs, expectations and restrictions embedded in the ideologies of what an architect should be, like the individual male genius for one. But gender, which is the social and cultural process of beliefs, expectations and restrictions about women, what women and men are and should be, strongly infect these dimensions, such as building is a man's world, etc. So what happens when these two structural and cultural multi-dimensional systems collide? These are some quotes from my interviewees. I think it was over 1,000 pages of transcript, so this is a very limited selection. So one guy said, the point is there's lots of women in architecture school and there's fewer later on. Yeah, everyone knows that. And one senior woman, she was fabulous, she said, I'm not being cynical, it's just being observant. You can see the patterns. And then one younger woman said, well, when you first graduated, there's lots to learn and you don't worry about things. But after a while, you begin to wonder, what on earth's going on around here? I don't have a great deal of time, but I want to talk about one of the kind of key things that came out of my PhD. I called it project devotion. Now, clearly, to do architecture is to do projects. You know, it's on projects that you build a portfolio that gets you more work, you build your career on projects, and you build your reputation on projects. And we learn to devote ourselves to projects starting at architecture school. And into the profession, the imperative of the project is consistently promoted. And the ideal architect is one who will push all boundaries for the project that they are working on. To create architecture seems to mean to always do more than what your fellow students are doing, more than what clients might expect, and more than what other architects might do in the same situation, which is one of the reasons that long hours tend to be part and parcel of project devotion. Although, please note that Andrew Maynard, who I was looking at earlier, is award-winning without doing those long hours. So my interviewees spoke of staying in a firm or leaving it because of a project, of ambition not for themselves, but for the project, of tolerating long hours, poor pay, and sometimes illegal working conditions because of a project, of allegiance to the firm, not to the firm, but to a project, and of delaying having children to complete a project. And why not? You know, projects are diverse and complex, they're absorbing, they're exciting, they're a really intellectual challenge of problem solving, of negotiating all the complexities of technical requirements and the social interactions and, you know, wrangling lots and lots of people. And architecture in this scenario becomes a lifestyle. So we check Art Daily, Dezeen, follow amazing posts on Instagram, arrange holidays to visit buildings. You know, it's all about architecture. But projects can also be relentless, and the more you give, the more they can take. Architecture can become an unrequited love. You love it, but it doesn't necessarily treat you terribly well, which can explain why people who leave it can become very bitter. When gender collides with project devotions, things become particularly unstuck for women. Again and again, I heard that the reason why there are so few senior or older women in architecture is because of women. And it's partly true, but nowhere near the whole story. Nonetheless, having children sets up a competing devotion for women. Not for men, but for women it does. And so what you've got is the same old patterns of the gender division of labour kicking in and kicking hard. Women should devote themselves to the children and the men should work hard to provide for the family. If women architects had children, they were often automatically excluded from good roles on good projects. This was in the firms that I was embedded in. And that's because of the assumed time demands. You know, you can't devote yourself to a project if you've got kids. Honestly, that's doesn't work. Importantly, for those without children, just the potential of becoming pregnant could remove you from the good roles on the good projects. And one director of a firm said to me, "Well, it's just a business decision." But it's about more than maternity or the potential for it. Project devotion also contributes to a tolerance of really weak and really poor management processes in architecture, because there's a distrust of processes that might encroach on the project devotion imperative. In particular, tolerance of bad management can lead to the most recent project that I've been looking at for Parlour, sexual harassment and bullying. We ran a survey last year. We got over 1,000 responses, and I'm in the middle of analysing this data, and there's a lot of it. We gave people too much opportunity to write long stories, and they take a lot of reading. Some people were nervous about telling us about incidents because they were frightened of being identified. And it's a small community, and you can't badmouth the name architect. And then another one sort of said, if I were to detail all the bullying and discrimination from undergraduate times until the present, it would be pages and pages and pages. One thing was for sure that the survey captured quite a high prevalence of both sexual harassment and bullying in the profession. And, some identified the poor management skills and high stress levels of architects in positions of power. Others laid it at the blame of the cult of the single genius male, and all the affordances given to those who are seen as genius. And if you're a genius, you're excused from if you are an absolutely awful human being. You're also protected. And there were many stories of how untouchable perpetrators of sexual harassment and bullying were. Interesting, that's likely to change in Australia as recent legislation has made all firms across Australia, not just architectural ones, liable if they allow bullying and sexual harassment to happen. So we'll have to see what happens with that. Some thought that sexual harassment and bullying are endemic in the architecture profession. However, others claimed that the prevalence is very much dependent on the culture of a particular practice, and there is a wide range of different practices in architecture, which is why I will always advise people, if you're having a really crap time where you are, change. See, you don't have to put up with that. And there were some practices, we asked people not to identify people or practices, but they did. And some practices and individuals are notorious, but that's not necessarily known by young graduates who end up walking into a nightmare. And bullying was, of course, not seen as bullying, but as toughening people up and just the way that person is, and so it was normalised. Something that I think surprised me a little bit, people thought that bullying was a greater problem in architecture and the built environment than sexual harassment. 100 is a big problem and 0 is not a problem, and these were the averages that came out. And they stayed true when broken down by gender. People told us about incidents, and while perpetrators of sexual harassment were predominantly men, I think it was like 94% or something, over 1/3 of the bullying incidents, 36%, were perpetrated by women. Bullying is more equal opportunities, I guess. To avoid the perpetrator, respondents absented themselves from professional engagements and functions, such as conferences, awards, special talks like this one we're having here, and even registration. And this, of course, is really going to cramp their career. Bullying and sexual harassment were often hard to spot, with incidents that on their own seem quite minor, and nothing to fuss about, really. Whatever. But repetition and the accumulation of them made them deeply unpleasant day to day. And now, there'll be more about this survey. I'm meant to be writing a really big report someday this year, but it will be out on the Parlour website. I want to take a couple of side steps now, and I'm going to show you some actual architecture. This is a building that a good friend of mine was involved in, and and visiting it, I was actually tempted to think that there might indeed be a feminine aesthetic. Vajrasana is a Buddhist retreat centre in Suffolk, which was designed by women architects. The firm is called Walters and Cohen, and they were the first recipients of the AJ Women Architect of the Year Awards in 2012. And another woman was the lead client representative, my friend, who is an architect herself, and another alumni of Auckland. And the project leaders were all women. Although two of them got pregnant during the 5-year life of the project, it went fine. Cindy Walters came to my friend and sort of said, "Oh, whoever was the project leader is pregnant. That's the second one. If you like, we can put a guy on it." And my friend sort of went, "No way, no, stick with the women." It's very carefully comprised of calm spaces with persistent views to the wider landscape and the rural setting, and that was very deliberate. For many of the users are Londoners who are used to horizons limited by less than ideal buildings. It's what I would call a quiet architecture with none of the bravura form making that would mark it out for archi-porn sites. It draws on a local tradition of burnt timber farm buildings, and it's really carefully considered with a simplicity that belies the work that I know went into making it. But I did decide in the end it was actually not really to do with the women, the architects being women, but more to do with the process. The clients were clear that the design had to arise out of the Buddhist group's practice, and the architects were really open to exploring that. And although it is a project that has been value managed to within an inch of its life, it's one that everyone who worked on it believed in and worked together to make it happen. It was collaboration. This is collaboration, making good architecture. There's a really restrained materials palette, often of relatively cheap materials, simply but at times delicately deployed. It's kind of minimalist, but with less of the coldness that can make minimalism beautiful to look at, but not quite so good to be in. It's Eileen Gray's nuanced modernism of more than visual. It's not flashy and heroic, but there is instead this architectural journey that when you move through the complex, you experience. Gray thought that simplicity in architecture was not simplification, and especially not simplification done with crudeness. The other thing that this project made me think about, because I was hearing about the whole progress of what was going on blow by blow from my friend, is something that also came up in my thesis, and that is the invisible work needed to ensure the success of a project, particularly on site, but also through the design process. All that preempting of problems and resolving them, sometimes before anybody else knows they exist. This work is behind the scenes and not necessarily always valued. How often do architects hear, "It's just a drawing? That's easy, you can do that. Why are you charging me so much?" Or, "Gosh, those builders were so good. What did you actually do?" The role of an architect is not unlike the sport of curling, where they slide those stones over the ice, and there are people who run ahead of the stones, sweeping it to make the glide the smoothest possible, and that's the architect. This invisibility aligns it somewhat with the classic women's work, the kind of domestic mental load of a household that is much talked about these days, and there's kind of more to unpack about that there. Again, I get a bit nervous, masculine, feminine, male, female, your role, his role, etc. The other side step I want to make is to show you some of the work of the XYX lab at Monash University. the lab investigated gender in space. So if Parlour's work is about investigating how gender impacts the participation of women in architecture and what can be done about it, the XIYX work is concerned with the impact of gender in the daily lives of women using public space and what can be done about it. Like Parlour, we're interested in building bridges from research into making a real difference. So this is a set of toolkits for, one of them's about gender-sensitive placemaking, and they're downloadable if you want to have a look at them. And part of it was about explaining very clearly to people what gender is about and what it means. So what gender as a social system, and I've spoken about that earlier, does is set up a really powerful hierarchy which gives rise to gender bias and gender inequality. Gender bias is prejudiced actions or thoughts based on the perception that women are not equal to men in rights and dignity. And gender inequality is legal, social and cultural situation in which sex and or gender determines different rights and dignity for women and men. This means that we live in a gendered world, and there are multiple consequences of living in this gendered world, but the main ones that impact the access and inclusion of women in public urban spaces are gender-based violence and a gender bias-built environment. It's worth noting that there's a kind of feedback mechanism at work here. The violence and the environment also produce and reinforce gender inequality in each other. Gender-based violence powerfully affects how women and girls understand their place in the world. And in the built environment context, gender bias leads to places not being designed for women's needs, wants and interests. And yeah, not all women want the same things, but not having to queue for public toilets while men never seem to have to would be something that I think all of us would appreciate. Both living in both gender-based violence and bias in the built environment lead to subtle and not so subtle messages that women do not belong in public spaces, which reinforces social and economic inequities. As a consequence, and particularly of gender-based violence, women are vigilant in public spaces. It's not that we don't use them, but that too often we're kind of a bit ill at ease sometimes, we're on guard, and we modify how we behave. And we exclude ourselves from using some public spaces in the same way that men might use them. In addition, if spaces are not designed with our interests, we can feel definitely excluded. Living in a gendered world also means women can lack agency in influencing public space. And here we link back to the paucity of women in leadership positions in architecture. So as designers and planners, we really need to remind ourselves of the built-in biases of the norm or the typical of the, it's always done that way, that we can easily fall into. And we need to question assumptions that we kind of didn't know were assumptions. So this is a quick example of how what seems to be gender-neutral process actually isn't. So it's showing the different reasons why people use public transport in Spain. And by far the largest is employment. So it's no wonder that our transport systems are shaped by work commuting patterns. But given the higher employment rate of men overall, there's a hidden bias in here. What's more, Inés Sanchez de Madariaga took a closer look at this data and reasoned that a portion of some of these trips or these categories could be reclassified as caring work, which is typically carried out by women, not always, but typically. And when these are grouped together, caring work trips numbers start to rival those of employment. And this is an example about how the very, very traditional gender roles of man the breadwinner, woman the homemaker, blah, blah, are embedded into our built environment. And contemporary life is way more complicated than this kind of binary construction. And this kind of data, the one on the left, helps set policy and design for public transport infrastructure. But if the original data categories are skewed by gender bias, as they are in the left diagram, transportation systems will struggle to serve the complex needs of all the caregivers who use or would like to use them. So my final two questions at the beginning had kind of multiplied over the years, and actually, like many things, there's no one single bullet answer to any of these questions. Social constructions of gender are really complex and tightly woven into our everyday lives. So all architects draw lines, but are perhaps less aware of the lines that they draw to contain themselves within the profession that limit it and themselves. These lines exclude some and include others, but these lines are formed by the social structure of the architecture profession and a kind of gendered substructure within it. And they're not fixed and they're not final because they are socially constructed. Every one of us in this room, particularly the older ones, has shifted those social constructions over time. The profession is therefore always in flux and shifts and moves across time and situation. The challenge for women and men in architecture is that although the lines are always negotiated, they can often, like the lines in CAD, snap to a grid of gender discouragement. So all I can say is watch out for that and see what you can do to move those lines. Thank you.